Trump thought Canada would never dare. For years, Washington believed Ottawa would always follow its lead, especially when it came to China. But that illusion shattered the moment Mark Carney made a move that stunned both Trump and Beijing, a trade shift so bold that it redefined Canada's global standing overnight. This wasn't just about tariffs or cars. It was about who controls the future of the North American economy. While Trump barked about loyalty and America first, Carney quietly built something far more powerful: economic freedom. Behind closed doors, as the U.S. demanded obedience, China offered a deal, one that looked simple on paper, but had the potential to turn the entire global balance upside down. And when Carney accepted it, he didn't just open new markets. He opened a new era where Canada would never again bow to American pressure. This is the story of how one decision made under pressure, under threat, turned Canada from Washington's junior partner into a world player. And it's a story Trump never saw coming. It began with a threat, a single statement from Washington that sent shockwaves through Ontario's industrial heartland. U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick stood before cameras and declared, "In vehicle production, it will be America first, Canada second." It sounded like rhetoric until Trump's administration made it real with a looming 25% tariff on all cars and parts shipped from Canada to the U.S. For Southern Ontario, that was a direct hit. Nearly 500,000 Canadians depend on the auto supply chain, a system tightly woven with Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. Every car built in Windsor or Oshawa carries U.S. parts. Every American SUV contains Canadian steel. But Trump didn't care. To him, trade wasn't partnership. It was a contest of dominance. Within days, investors panicked. Canadian exports faced losses in the tens of billions. Steel and aluminum, plants slowed production. And for the first time, Ottawa realized something painful. Its economy was too dependent on American goodwill. Carney, newly in power, saw it clearly. Decades of integration had made Canada strong, but also vulnerable. And while Trump weaponized tariffs, Carney began plotting something the White House didn't expect. Because Carney understood one truth Washington had forgotten: strategy always beats strength. Then came the message from Beijing: quiet, strategic, and perfectly timed. As Trump tightened the screws, China extended a hand. Its ambassador told Ottawa, "Drop your 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, and we'll drop ours on your canola." To most, it seemed transactional. To Carney, it was an opening. China knew Canada's pain. After all, Beijing had imposed its own 100% tariff on Canadian canola after Ottawa sided with Washington's EV restrictions. Farmers were losing billions. Grain elevators sat idle. Yet Beijing's offer wasn't charity, it was chess. By linking agriculture to electric vehicles, China forced Canada to weigh loyalty against logic. The numbers were undeniable. Chinese EVs priced between 35,000 and 40,000 Canadians would give Canadians affordable green options while reopening access to a billion-person export market for Canadian crops. Economically, it made sense. Politically, it was explosive. In Washington's eyes, even talking to China was betrayal. But Carney didn't see it that way. He saw balance. He saw leverage. And he understood that if Canada could play both sides without picking one, it could finally escape the decades-old shadow of U.S. dependency. Trump had pushed too hard, and China had just handed Carney the countermove he needed. Instead of making grand declarations, Carney acted quietly. He launched a plan Ottawa called sectoral resilience. It wasn't a slogan. It was an escape plan. Rather than chasing one massive free trade deal like NAFTA, Carney's team began crafting smaller targeted agreements across critical sectors: steel, aluminum, agriculture, and clean energy. Each deal strengthened one piece of Canada's industrial base while reducing exposure to U.S. pressure. Billions were redirected into domestic manufacturing and battery production. Ontario's steel belt received fresh subsidies. Northern provinces gained new investments in nickel and lithium mining, minerals China needed for EV batteries. Behind the scenes, Carney's advisors met with Asian investors to secure joint ventures that would bring funding without surrendering control. It was subtle, deliberate, and ruthless in its precision. By diversifying quietly, Canada made itself too integrated with too many partners for Trump to isolate. And when China realized Carney wasn't capitulating, but re-engineering Canada's supply chain, they leaned in. Beijing began sending high-level envoys. exploring technology cooperation and resource partnerships. Carney's message was simple: we'll trade with everyone, but obey no one. Washington didn't hear the words, but soon it would feel the consequences. While Carney was quietly building resilience, Trump's grand experiment with tariffs was crumbling from within. What was sold to Americans as an economic revival was turning into a self-inflicted wound. Steel and aluminum costs in the U.S. shot up nearly 20% within months. Automakers in Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin, states Trump once called his industrial backbone, were now laying off workers, delaying production, and watching profits vanish. Factories that relied on cross-spur parts suddenly faced shortages. The irony was painful. The very bolts, engines, and raw materials American companies needed were sitting just across the Canadian border, made too expensive to import by Trump's own tariffs. Prices for cars spiked. American consumers paid more, and the workers Trump promised to protect were among the first to lose shifts. Economists began calling it the boomerang effect. Every 10% increase in tariffs was cutting Midwest manufacturing output by nearly 2%. The White House dismissed the data, insisting billions were flowing in, but those billions came from U.S. businesses forced to pay the price. Meanwhile, Canada adapted. As the U.S. tightened its grip, Ottawa opened new routes. Carney's government redirected exports to Asia, where demand for Canadian metals, crops, and energy quietly replaced lost American sales. Instead of collapsing, Canada evolved. Trump had intended to corner Canada. Instead, his policies handed Carney the perfect justification to modernize the economy and to prove that flexibility beats fear. By mid-year, American factories were slowing. Canadian trade diversification was accelerating, and the truth was undeniable. The real loser of Trump's tariff war wasn't China or Canada. It was the United States itself. And the world was watching as Washington's economic power play transformed into a global case study in how arrogance destroys advantage. Trump's tariff war didn't just backfire on Canada, it fractured the very alliances that once defined American power. Across the Pacific, Japan and South Korea, two of Washington's most loyal economic partners began losing patience. In Tokyo, the outrage started quietly. The U.S. had demanded that Japan invest 550 billion yen to rebuild American manufacturing. Trump's team called it a partnership. Japanese officials called it economic blackmail. One lawmaker bluntly said, "This isn't cooperation, it's coercion." For decades, Japan had accepted U.S. leadership, but this time the tone felt different. Washington wasn't negotiating, it was dictating. South Korea's story was even more dramatic. The White House wanted $350 billion in new investments structured entirely under U.S. control. Then came the breaking point, a shocking immigration raid at Hyundai's Georgia plant, where Korean engineers were detained mid-shift. The images flooded Seoul's news cycle, sparking outrage across the country. Newspapers called it a public humiliation, proof that America no longer treated its allies as equals. Within weeks, both Tokyo and Seoul froze their negotiations. Trade talks stalled, investments halted. The trust that once anchored U.S. influence in Asia began to crumble. Mark Carney was watching every move. The same coercive playbook Washington used on Japan and Korea was now being aimed at Canada. Invest billions in U.S. factories or face tariffs. But Carney had learned from their resistance. He realized that saying no wasn't isolation, it was independence. And for the first time in decades, three Democratic allies, Canada, Japan, and South Korea, quietly shared a single thought: the cost of American loyalty had become too high. Trump wanted a circle of followers. What he created instead was a coalition of equals, united by frustration and ready to move on without him. By the end of autumn, Canada's quiet transformation had become impossible to ignore. While Washington was still demanding obedience, Ottawa was building something far more sustainable. A trade model built on balance, flexibility, and control. Mark Carney called it the pivot to pragmatism. It wasn't about choosing China over America. It was about choosing Canada first in the truest sense of the word. Carney understood that in a world of weaponized trade, survival depended on agility. So instead of chasing another massive risky free trade agreement like NAFTA, his government began weaving a web of smaller targeted partnerships across Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Each deal strengthened one sector of the economy, from battery minerals and clean energy to agriculture and manufacturing, creating layers of protection against political volatility. China's electric vehicle market opened new export doors. Japanese automakers invested in Ontario's battery plants. South Korean tech companies started scouting Canada for semiconductor collaboration. Ottawa didn't need to pick sides anymore. It was building bridges to both. At home, Canadian factories that once depended solely on U.S. contracts were now shipping products to Tokyo, Seoul, and Shanghai. Farmers who once feared losing access to American buyers found fresh demand in Asia's expanding middle class. For the first time in decades, Canada's trade map wasn't drawn around Washington. It was global. Carney's plan worked because it wasn't emotional. It was structural. He knew shouting back at Trump would achieve nothing, but building a resilient, interconnected economy would quietly do what sanctions and speeches couldn't: make Canada untouchable. The world was changing, and Carney made sure Canada changed with it. In a single year, dependency turned into diversification, and loyalty turned into leverage. When Mark Carney finally walked into the Oval Office, the cameras were already waiting. The American and Canadian flags stood side by side. Smiles were rehearsed. The press snapped photos of two allies reaffirming friendship, but behind those diplomatic smiles, the tension was razor sharp. Trump began with praise, calling Canada a great partner before shifting to pressure. He demanded that Ottawa commit billions of dollars to build new factories on U.S. soil. The message was clear. If Canada wanted tariff relief, it would have to pay for it. To most leaders, that might have sounded like an order, but Carney didn't flinch. Calmly, he pushed back. He told Trump that Canada's economy no longer revolved around Washington's approval, that Ottawa now had partners in Asia, Europe, and beyond. "We've diversified," he said, his tone measured but firm. "Our industries don't collapse when someone across the border raises their voice." For a moment, the room went silent. Trump wasn't used to hearing defiance, especially from a neighbor America had long considered dependent. The cameras caught none of it, but officials in both delegations later confirmed it was a turning point. When the meeting ended, Trump forced a grin for the cameras and declared the talks productive, but insiders knew the truth. Carney hadn't come to seek permission. He'd come to draw a line. In that silent, strategic confrontation, the entire balance of power shifted. Canada was no longer the junior partner in North American trade. It was an equal player with its own orbit. Trump left the room believing he'd held firm. But in reality, Carney had just proven that diplomacy could defeat domination and that quiet resolve could do what tariffs never could: reclaim sovereignty. What started as Trump's promise to make America first has ended, with the U.S. standing more isolated than ever. Across the Pacific and the Atlantic, once loyal allies have stopped waiting for Washington to lead. Japan is charting its own trade future. South Korea is diversifying investments. And Canada, long seen as America's dependable partner, has quietly become the symbol of post-American independence. Carney's vision of sectoral resilience had turned into a geopolitical ripple effect. It proved that smaller nations could thrive through balance, not blind loyalty. By diversifying, Canada showed others that survival in a turbulent world meant flexibility, not submission. Meanwhile, Trump's policies continued to backfire at home. U.S. factories slowed. Foreign investments dried up, and even American farmers faced retaliation abroad. The supposed economic revival had become a maze of tariffs and trade disputes that pushed friends away and strengthened rivals. Canada, Japan, and South Korea didn't rebel. They adapted. They began forming a quiet alliance of their own, democratic economies cooperating through shared frustration with Washington's unpredictability. Together they represented something new, a world less reliant on American dominance and more focused on mutual respect. For decades, the U.S. could count on its allies to follow orders, but Trump's strategy of threats and ultimatums shattered that trust. America First had morphed into America Alone. Carney's diplomacy didn't shout or grandstand. It simply built alternatives, trade routes, energy corridors, and technological alliances that no tariff could stop. And as the world watched America isolate itself, Canada emerged as the calm counterweight. The country that proved quiet strength can outlast loud power. The era of economic obedience was over. A new order was forming, one where even the smallest nations could stand tall. In the end, Trump's trade crusade was supposed to make America unshakable. Instead, it made the world unafraid. What he saw as leverage, others saw as warning, a glimpse of what happens when friendship turns into coercion. And while Washington doubled down on tariffs, Mark Carney quietly rewrote the rules of modern economics. He didn't wage war, he built resilience, he didn't chase power, he created independence. Every sanction, every tariff, every threat from the US became fuel for Canada's transformation. Factories once reliant on American buyers now shipped products to Tokyo, Seoul, and Shanghai. Farmers who once feared U.S. retaliation were now feeding new markets across Asia. The trade web Carney built wasn't rebellion, it was insurance. And that's the paradox of Trump's strategy. By trying to force loyalty, he inspired liberation. Canada didn't break away in anger. It evolved out of necessity. What began as survival soon became leadership, proof that influence in the 21st century isn't measured by dominance, but by adaptability. Carney's legacy is more than a political victory. It's a blueprint for small nations navigating a world of giants. Through patience, structure, and quiet strength, he turned vulnerability into sovereignty. The cameras might show Trump speaking louder, but history will remember Carney thinking smarter, because while the United States built walls of tariffs, Canada built bridges of trade. And those bridges are now carrying an entire economy toward a future where no nation, no president, and no tariff can ever hold it hostage again. This wasn't just a trade story. It was the moment Canada learned that real power doesn't come from shouting the loudest. It comes from standing the tallest, even in silence.